Well, hello everyone, and welcome back for our third night of mindfulness. Um, I'm Dexter Marr. I'll be your host. Tonight. I think most of you are, returning participants, but I see some new faces too. So, just want to make sure that we welcome you with open arms, and tell you that our bathrooms are that away through that door, and our refreshment table is scrumptious and wonderful, and open, throughout the whole presentation. So, whenever you feel the need to, get something, feel free to do so. Um, Also like to thank, all those folks that have been bringing, goodies, through the last few days and in the next couple of days, and those that stay to help, clean up also. Takes a small village to get, everything done for something like this. Um, Please, if you have cell phones, turn them to silent mode. Again, um, we are recording these sessions live, and they are stored on YouTube. So if you just go to youtube.com and type in BSC space Hawaii, you can catch those parts that you've missed, or you just are so intrigued that you want to hear them again. A reminder, tomorrow we'll have a group photo, at the break about 7:30. So for those of you that need to wash your hair or comb your hair, or put on a clean shirt, you're so forewarned. Our format will be the same as we've been having, which is about an hour of lecture, then about a 10-minute question and answer section, followed by a 15-minute, kind of refreshment break stretch, and then a return for about another 30 to 40 minutes of lecture, and closing with about another 10 minutes of questions and answers. We have little note cards for those of you that are shy and reluctant to speak into our microphone with a question. So if you write your question down, we can just bring it up to the podium, and Dr. Wilson can address it that way. Okay. So without further ado, I'll get off the stage, and Jeff will talk about mainstreaming mindfulness. And it's hard to be green, I guess. Not easy.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Dexter. I think this is picking me up all right. Okay, so good evening, everyone. It's good to see you again. I hope you had a good day. I certainly did. Just a moment ago, it was so lovely. There was a full bow rainbow right out there, and then there's the half moon as well was up there above it, and then over the mountains just in this direction. Really quite a lovely sight. It seemed very Hawaiian to me, so it was quite a lovely thing for me to see. So as Dexter was saying, most people have been here for the last couple days, but also there may be some people who were not here for the first couple of days. I apologize. We are sort of moving through material, and though I may give a few callbacks to what we've already done, mostly we are going to be covering new material for tonight. But if you are new and something is a little confusing, or you wonder if I talked about something earlier, by all means during the Q&A session, just put your hand up, and we'll try to sort through that sort of stuff. So tonight's topic is mainstreaming mindfulness. And basically, it's related to the picture here of our friend Kermit the Frog. The Muppet Show is back on the air in the last season. And, Kermit was finding it very stressful to put on the Muppet Show. And I guess Miss Piggy was stressing him out and everything. So he did naturally what any American might do today, particularly someone who works in the entertainment industry. He went on a mindfulness retreat. So this is a screen capture from that episode. He's sitting there on his meditation cushion, being mindful. So, even Muppets know at this point that if you want to calm down and deal with your stress, of course, mindfulness is the way in which you're supposed to do it these days. It has become entirely mainstream. It's no longer just something that's confined to Buddhism or to Buddhist monks or such. So we're going to talk about how are Americans using mindfulness today. If it's no longer just about Buddhism or just about sort of Buddhist aspirations such as nirvana, but is now available to everyone in American culture, well, what are they actually doing with this? So just to start us off here, there's different ways that we can approach the situation of religion in America today, including the situation of Buddhism. So there are sociologists who believe that religion is dying out, that it has a steady downward trend, even if it's still pretty healthy. But it's definitely not as strong as it was a generation ago, and that was not as strong as a generation before that, and so on. So we can see where the trend lines are going. Eventually, religion will die out and be extinct like the dodo bird in this way. And they have polls and data that they try to use to support this point of view. So the coming extinction of religion, maybe. I tend, however, to support a second possible interpretation of the data, which is that religion is not going to go extinct, is not dying out, but in fact what we are seeing is actually a great flourishing or diversification of religious phenomena. So it may be that some things are on the decline. For example, formal membership in sectarian religious organizations and attendance of the regular services of institutionalized religion, these things are definitely on the decline. But if that's your only model for religion in America, maybe it feels like things are declining or going extinct. But there's a lot more that's going on out there. People haven't abandoned the churches and therefore abandoned religion altogether. But instead, actually, they're doing lots of other things. If anything, there's actually more religious type activity in America today than there ever was. Back in the day where everybody was nominally a member of a church or temple or whatever, it wasn't that big a deal. It was kind of a social thing and people didn't necessarily have to put their thoughts into it. Today, with the freedom to choose much more greatly than people used to have, and a great diversity of material available online and through other sorts of media, people are still having spiritual needs and they're still trying to get those spiritual needs met, but they're often doing it outside of the formal institutions. Mindfulness is a pretty good example of this. It is a way in which Buddhism has not declined, but in fact is diversified and is offering new phenomena in America. Mindfulness is a good Buddhist example. I'll just say, I can't help it as a sociologist of American religion, that there's a lot of other stuff going on as well. We see this with Christian phenomena, all sorts of things. So I think that religion in the modern day is actually diversifying and adapting and offering all sorts of new possibilities. Whether or not these are good or bad, that's for everyone in particular to decide for themselves, but we certainly see a diversification going on. And one of the things that we then should bring into the conversation when we talk about Buddhism and how things have been changing is by being aware of the role that Buddhism has played often in the past. So Buddhism is a very large, very rich, very diverse set of religious phenomena. People engage in it for many reasons. There are many purposes to it. One of the primary things that Buddhism has been for people in the past in Asia is a system for providing benefits that people are seeking. So people want something out of religion or want something out of Buddhism, and to the extent that Buddhism has provided them those things, Buddhism has thrived and survived and been healthy in this way. And when Buddhism didn't seem to provide things that people wanted, naturally enough, they looked elsewhere to try to get those needs that they felt met, right? So by providing benefits, to people. This is one of the main ways that Buddhism has survived. And of course, each culture is different. So the desires, the needs that different groups of people have depend to a significant degree on where they're born, what culture they grow up in, how they're socialized. So they ask for different things out of religion or out of life depending on where they live, what culture they're in. And Buddhism has crossed over different cultural boundaries, partially by learning to adapt and provide the benefits that people now in a new host culture want. As usual, I'll give you some examples from India to China and then to Japan, because this seems to be my MO this week. So here's a good example of this sort of dynamic. Here we have an extract from a sutra, very widely practiced in the past in East Asia. The sutra on perfect wisdom for kings who wish to protect their states. So this is a sutra that gives a sermon of the Buddha in which he describes certain practices. It is set in India. It was not written in India. This is a Chinese text that is sort of masking the fact that it's a Chinese invention by placing the story in the time of the Buddha and in India, where the Buddha lived, right? So what's going on here? Well, this Chinese text is suggesting that Buddhism can be used to provide benefits that the Chinese were very interested in receiving from religion. In particular, this sutra alleges that Buddhism provides benefits that kings and other powerful possible patrons might be looking for. So the sutra says that if wise kings patronize Buddhism, if they donate land and money so that there can be monasteries and many monks can live there, and if they donate so that Buddhist scriptures can be copied and Buddhist statues can be created and everything, that this is a wonderful thing, because then the Buddhist gods and the Buddhas will be very happy with them, and they will protect their states. They will prevent barbarian invasions. They will prevent floods and catastrophes. They will prevent civil unrest and revolt. So if you are a king and you want to stay a king, patronize Buddhism and we'll keep you in power. You scratch our back, we'll scratch yours. That's essentially what's going on here in this sutra. So this was a sutra that was a teaching that was convincing to many people in China, and it was important also in Japan and Korea. And so we see here that people are writing Buddhist texts in order to be able to use Buddhism to deliver the benefits that they're looking for. Chinese rulers wanted to stay in power, and they wanted to genuinely run their states well and have their states be healthy and protected. So they were interested in hearing a message that Buddhism could help provide this benefit to them. Is this about nirvana? Absolutely not. No. There's many aspects to such a large and diverse religion as Buddhism, and this is, let's say, the more worldly side of it. But an important side that allowed Buddhism to become popular in China. And then once kings are building all these monasteries and everything, you do have the meditation monks and the scholar monks and all the other people living there, as well as the people who are just like, hey, king, give us some money, you know, that sort of thing, right? So, got to get paid somehow. Now, let's look at the Japanese situation, just for another sort of example here. So, George Tanabe, scholar that many of us may be familiar with, professor emeritus from University of Hawaii. He co-wrote a book that was very influential on my thinking back in graduate school, a book called Practically Religious, where he and his co-author Ian Reeder, they point out the prevalence of something called Ginzei Ryaku in Japanese religion, especially Japanese Buddhism, but Japanese religion in general. These Ginzei Ryaku can be translated as this worldly or practical benefits. And they assert that people in Japan, from the very beginning of Buddhism, have been looking to Buddhism and to religion to provide them with very practical benefits that they wanted. And to the extent that Buddhism did offer to provide these things, this is what helped make Buddhism such a universally appealing religion to so many different people. In a way, the previous Chinese example is kind of for people at the top of the pyramid. You know, if you're not a king, but you're not really interested in protecting your state in this way. This Japanese version of that kind of seeking benefits from Buddhism, this was for everybody. This was for everyday concerns that people might have. So you pray to the Buddhas and pray to the Buddhist gods in order to receive very practical benefits. And here's an example of that sort of thing. Again, we're still in Japan, but don't worry, we'll be back in America in a minute. All right, who can tell me, what are these? Good luck charms, that's right. What's the term in Japanese, do we know? Omomori, yeah. So these are Japanese good luck charms, or the word can be translated sort of literally as like a protective charm or protective amulet, right? Omomori. So every Buddhist temple in Japan, except the Honganji ones, sell these things, right? Every other tradition does actually quite a brisk business. It's an important source of their income, is providing these good luck charms to people, and certainly members buy them, but they're just available for the whole public. Anybody can come by and get it whenever they have a need that needs to be met. And there's kind of a list on here. I chose this photograph from my files because it happens to have English on it, but I don't know how well we can read it. We see recovery from illness is for one. You buy a different one if you want to pass school. There's another one for safe delivery of children. Over on the left-hand side, the very popular one, safe driving or protection from traffic accidents. So there's many of these sort of things. These have been kicking around in Japan pretty much as long as we have any evidence of sort of Buddhist material culture there. So the idea of providing very practical benefits. This is not a protective amulet to achieve nirvana, right? This is just everyday. This is not even like protective amulet, protect the nation from barbarian invasion. No, it's really practical stuff. Like me, I might not want to get in a car accident, right? I might not want to get sick, you know. So it's very practical stuff on the everyday level that people are getting. By the way, actually, Hawaii is one of the only places in America where you can buy these at local temples and Shinto shrines as well. So you don't find these really hardly anywhere on the mainland, but they're around here. I know some of you have them in your cars, so maybe many of you. It's a common sort of thing. And actually, it's kind of funny. Even these go through a process of adaptation in America. So one type that I've seen only here in Hawaii, I've never seen it in Japan, though it may exist at this point, but I've never seen it anywhere else. They've got golf omomoris, so to protect you from like a slice or from water traps or whatever. Yeah. In fact, this is probably pretty popular because everybody seems to like to golf. Maybe that's what people in the Honganji temples mostly have. A lot of golfers. Okay, all right. Now we're back to America. All right. Practical benefits. So I've been talking this week about how people have been adjusting the presentation of Buddhist mindfulness practices in order to make them appealing and available to large audiences of Americans, not just people who are already kind of into Buddhism in this way, but people who might never darken the door of a Buddhist temple or ever go on retreat. So here's a good example of this sort of thing, and this is Buddhist mindfulness-derived meditation practice, which is designed to deliver practical benefits to people. Sort of the ultimate benefit, right? Happiness. There you go. Everybody wants happiness, I assume. Maybe some emo people don't, but most everybody wants it, right? You want to be happy, and there's a real attempt to sort of present this as not being Buddhist or not being religious, right? Notice how this is being entirely put not in a religious manner, but with 5 science-based practices, not religiously based practices, even though some of these are derived from religion, but science-based practices to boost your happiness, not 5 religious practices to help you achieve nirvana or go to heaven or something like that in some religious idiom, right? The science of happiness. And where do we find? We find that one of them, they're not numbered, but I guess maybe it's numbered 1 or 2 over here, mindful breathing. So it just says it's a simple way to gain peace of mind. Very easy thing for people to do. We do see, what I've pointed out time and again, we get this kind of echo or shadow of people sitting, like they're sitting in meditation or something, but it's never quite spelled out exactly. So that could be scientific too, I suppose. All right, so happiness, sort of one of the primary practical benefits you might get from mindfulness. Also, we talked a lot yesterday about medical applications of mindfulness. For example, mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based therapies people are using, and so on. Using mindfulness for health reasons is another really common American practical benefit. Okay, so the Satipatthana Sutta, we have been looking at this occasionally. So we have already seen this quote, I guess probably on day 1, where the Buddha instructed his monks in how to practice mindfulness and what to use it for. And as I pointed out, what does he say? Monks, this is the direct path for the purification of beings, overcoming sorrow and lamentation, for the disappearance of pain and grief. And this is, of course, for the realization of nirvana, is what all this is ultimately supposed to point to. That's the original goal of these practices. But if you got language in there like making pain and grief disappear, right? Getting rid of sorrow, these could be understood potentially in new ways, especially like very mundane ways. Instead of it being, the sorrow and pain that come from the terrible round of rebirth driven by karma, caused by attachment, et cetera, this would just be like, ow. My back hurts, I will use mindfulness and help get rid of that very specific direct pain. So here's what happens then in America. We get these reapplications of Buddhism in order to fit in with what people think a mainstream may want. So in the traditional approach, mindfulness in monastic Buddhism was being used to cultivate detachment from the sorrows of life. Once one is able to be detached, one is able to then proceed on the path to nirvana. But Americans get a hold of it, and what do? Instead of it being about getting away from the problems of the world, something subtle goes on. They put a more positive spin on it. It's not about pushing away the bad things. It's about enhancing the joyful or wonderful or pleasurable aspects of life. This is what we're going to see in many of the examples we're going to use for the rest of tonight's session. That there's this shift that goes on towards using mindfulness to enhance life instead of using mindfulness to sort of understand life and understand why it's better to move on to nirvana. Okay. And then just to continue the sort of evolutionary sort of framework or mode of analysis that we've been using. For example, looking at will things go extinct or will they diversify? Another part of evolution is, of course, diversification happens in part when species evolve to exploit new niches that become available to them, right? So if there's something that's not being eaten or used or lived in somehow in the ecosystem, it's a kind of an empty slot there, an empty niche. Eventually, some sort of animal or plant will evolve to take advantage of that, right? Well, the same sort of thing happens to a degree in human cultural phenomena as well, including religion. And so often, this is another way that Buddhism has been able to successfully move from earlier cultures into new ones. The original Buddhist culture and the new not yet Buddhist culture, right? They're different. There are things that are different about them. And so there are places in this new culture that probably are being not fully exploited or fully used by the indigenous sort of traditions that are already existing. And Buddhism then can come in, see those niches, and start kind of move in. These are available slots for it to move into and take advantage of as it seeks to implant itself into a new culture. Of course, since every culture differs, that spiritual ecosystem is going to be different, and so the adaptations or available niches over here will be different from the ones over there, and so on and so forth. Let's go back to our examples. We'll just look at Japan this time, since I've done a lot of China, but Buddhism as the religion of death, or specifically, the religion of funeral practices. This is one of its primary roles in Japan. Just as important as the idea of Buddhism providing practical benefits to people, another major thing about Japanese Buddhism, regardless of what tradition you're in, is the idea that Buddhism is a religion that helps you with maintenance of death. So why is this? Why did Buddhism become the #1 religion for helping with death and dying and funerals and memorials? Why was this available? Well, if we look into the Japanese past, we see that the native tradition, what we came to call eventually Shinto, tended to view death as dangerous, as polluting, as taboo, dead bodies in particular, as being highly dangerously polluting. If you came in contact with something dead, this could have serious consequences for you. So there were a lot of people who were very, sort of treating death and dead bodies very gingerly. There were absolutely local folk practices for burial and this sort of thing, but a lot of them had to do with being afraid of dead bodies, and there was like a real anxiety or disease that people felt around this sort of thing. The Buddhists did not have this taboo. Buddhists have been going to cemeteries in order to watch bodies rot since the day of the Buddha, right? He recommended in that very same Satipatthana Sutta that people should go and be mindful of rotting bodies in the cemetery. So the Buddhists didn't have the same sort of hang-up in this way. So they could move in on this, right? And in a related fashion, Shinto or the native Japanese tradition had very little to say about any type of afterlife. There were essentially no afterlife beliefs really at all in Japan prior to the introduction of Chinese culture, including Buddhist type ideas. So there was a very vague idea about Yomi, the land of the dead. Maybe it was in a cave or something. It's very, very vague. It just was not an area that the Japanese imagination had really developed in any way. And instead, they had just other concerns and other things they had put their attention into. So the Buddhists come in, and they have an extremely complicated, developed sense of the world, including unseen worlds that you may go to after death and all this sort of thing, right? So they've got beliefs about what we might call the afterlife, even though that's not perfect because it's just another form of life that people are circulating through, but we'll call it the afterlife. They've got beliefs about what happens after you die, and they're not afraid to deal with dead bodies. So naturally, they can move in on the funeral industry, essentially, and take this over, and this can be a major source of income and cultural sort of relevance and power for them. To the point where, for a long time, all funerals in Japan were all Buddhist, and still most of them are today, right? So an available niche, the Buddhists move in and take it over. This illustration is from a manual that I got in Japan. So this is, I guess, a sotoshu sort of thing. They actually created the idea that you actually ordain the body as a monk, and then this helps them to become enlightened in the afterlife. That was so successful as a Zen funeral idea that most other traditions eventually took this up in some fashion as well. Okay. So, what about North America? Well, when we look at the United States, when we look at Canada as well, what do we find? What are some of the available opportunities, the empty niches, perhaps, that Buddhism might sort of move in on, right? Well, one of them is that Christianity, which has been the dominant tradition in the United States, it has mostly lacked meditation traditions, especially meditation traditions or contemplative traditions that the average layperson could access. You know, there were certainly certain contemplative orders of like Catholic monks living in monasteries in different parts of North America. I'm not sure if there are any in Hawaii. So, but this was not something that the average person had any access to. So the average person didn't have any of these contemplative practices. So Buddhism is full of these. Maybe that's a niche that it can exploit. It can offer something this way. Another thing that I note is recently the rise of what's called spiritual but not religious persons. And this is related to that first slide about the decline of religion. People think it's going extinct. And that's because many more people, when polled these days, say, what religion are you? People say, well, you know, I'm kind of spiritual, but I'm not religious. Oh, no thank you, none of that religion stuff, right? Because people have developed an idea that you can sort of disaggregate these. So there's religion, which they associate with institutions, with dogma, with formalism, you know, this sort of thing. And then there's spirituality, which is more personal, free-form, liberating. Yeah, so there's sort of this distinction that people make. So as the sort of number of people willing to say, oh, I am this religion has declined. However, at the same time, then all these people are saying, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, which is say, I'm not religious but I am spiritual. So kind of same difference. This is what I'm saying, that the religion's not really dying out. What we're finding is a greater diversity of forms. Because we still have the people say, I am this religion, I am that religion, and we have the people now saying, well, I'm spiritual in this way or that way. So there's still a lot of this going on. But these are people who, by definition, are seekers. They're looking for something, but they're not necessarily members of institutions anymore. So they're available to pick up new practices and try them out, like maybe mindfulness, right? So these are sort of niches that are getting used by the mindfulness movement and allowing it to become very mainstream. So what do I mean when I use this term mainstream or mainstreaming? Well, it's the idea of applying Buddhism or aspects of Buddhism to meet the desires of new host cultures and people in new social locations. Specifically, I'm looking at the American example. So what we find is that whereas mindfulness was something practiced by mostly Asian Buddhist monks in the past, this will come as a great surprise to you, but most people in North America are actually non-Buddhist lay people. I know, shocking, right? So if it's going to move into the mainstream, if that's the mainstream and that's not the mainstream over there, you got to meet these people and meet their desires and needs. Now, what are their desires and needs? By definition, they're non-Buddhist, so they're not very interested in something like nirvana, right? That's not their thing. And they're lay people, and they're Americans, or North Americans. So they're not terribly interested in prayers to Buddhas or gods in order to protect the country that they're running. And they're not terribly interested in funeral services. That's already taken care of. So you've got to provide benefits that they want if you want it to move into the mainstream. And that's exactly what we see going on. Here are a few examples from the incredibly diverse ways that mindfulness is being used for sort of everyday concerns and everyday anxieties that average Americans have. Every one of these was not used previously in the diverse Asian Buddhist tradition, was not a way in which mindfulness was used, was not a purpose for mindfulness, really. But these are major ways that it's being used here because we're talking about a different culture. It calls forth new, different uses. So what do we see in particular? Mindful eating, which will be our primary example here before the break. Mindful sex, another really big one. Mindful parenting, mindful work, mindful sports. These are only 5. There's a huge, huge number of them. But these are, I think, quite good examples of the sort of phenomenon that I'm trying to talk about here. So let's look at mindful eating as a really good case example. Okay. Here are just a few books. This is about as many books that are published on mindful eating as come out just in any given, I don't know, 2, maybe 3-month period, year after year after year. They're just constantly being churned out by many different authors and by the same authors. Some people are building their entire career, making all of their money. They'll someday retire because they published books and led seminars and so on about mindful eating specifically. It's a huge phenomenon. It's one of the most popular ways in which mindfulness is being engaged with. And of course, this should not really surprise us because there's not a lot of industries bigger than the diet industry, or at least bigger than, let's say, food or eating related industries, right? We got to do this several times a day, maybe a bunch of times a day in my case, right? Everybody's eating all the time, and so people are also very worried about this. They're really obsessed with food. They are obsessed with body image and all the problems that come with eating as much as I do. So people have very great sort of anxieties around this. And the diet industry, as we know, is gigantic. So it really shouldn't be a surprise then that since this is a major American worry, a major American concern, this is maybe a practical benefit that mindfulness might be able to help people with. And if you can plausibly state that mindfulness helps you to slim down or deal with your eating anxiety or deal with your food issues, whatever they may be, if you can plausibly claim that or demonstrate that, then there's a real potential to mainstream mindfulness through this avenue. So, what do we see? Let's look at a few quotes from mindful eating authors. There's many of them, but I'll mainly look at some of the most popular or most prolific ones that are very easily encountered. So here's a quote I've taken from Mindful Eating, book by Jan Bays. Now, Jan Bays happens to be a Zen priest. She leads a monastery in Oregon. I've been there. And she's ordained. She lives at this monastery. She runs an entire Zen community. She has a long, long history with Zen Buddhism, going back decades, really sort of the part of the first generation of Americans being trained in Zen meditation and so on. But when she goes out in the world to talk about mindful eating, to try to reach a wider American audience, she basically leaves the robes behind. She doesn't present herself as, Reverend Jan Bays or, Sensei Jan Bays or something like this, right? Instead, she presents herself as a pediatrician, which is also what she is. Because, at least in America, being a Zen priest doesn't usually pay the bills. So she has, her whole career here, and also on top of that, runs this important Zen monastery in Oregon. So she puts it in a very scientific, medical sort of mode, and she talks about why we might need mindful eating. So what does she say here? The developed countries are in the midst of a serious epidemic of disordered relationships to food and eating. We're in urgent need of a treatment, this medical language, that will work equally for children and their parents. In this culture, we seem to be very uncomfortable with the collection of sensations we call hunger or thirst. We keep a drink always at hand. We snack all day long. Thus, over a single generation, we humans have developed a new form of suffering. Okay. I hear people sort of grunting and maybe nodding. Maybe they acknowledge that this seems compelling, perhaps. Maybe they might agree with this in some way. So we can note here that there's no overt Buddhism, but the book's called Mindful Eating. We kind of know where she's going to go with this, right? She's going to recommend Buddhist-type meditation. And also, there's the fingerprints of Buddhism all over this, right? The B of Buddhism never appears here. And yet, what is her concern? She's a Zen priest. She's talking about suffering, the collection of sensations we call hunger. I mean, this language sounds sort of, almost as if it wants to be sutric in a way, right? So she has this Buddhist perspective, but she doesn't present it as a Buddhist perspective. She presents this as sort of a common sense analysis of what's going on with the problems in America. And then she's going to suggest, of course, that mindfulness might help us with these sort of problems. Some of the alleged consequences that happen due to mindless eating. So this is from another author, Susan Alvers, Eating Mindfully. So now that mindful eating and eating mindfully have both been taken as book titles, everybody else has to keep coming up with new ways to basically present the same sort of material. So she has a list in there that I basically strained my fingers typing out because it's so long here. What does she say happens because of mindless eating? The failure to be mindful with our eating. Weakness, chronic tiredness, cuts and bruises, headaches, stomach pain, gas, vomiting blood, yikes. Dizzy, bowel movement problems, move on from that one. Dry skin, scars on your fingers, cold, cramps, lack of energy, and everything else imaginable, really, okay? So these are possible downsides if you are eating mindlessly. So we've got the problem of the food-obsessed culture, and then we have the dire consequences that come from that. So of course, therefore, the prescription here is going to be mindful eating. So what is mindful eating? To go back to Jan Bays here. So she says that mindful eating is a way to reawaken our pleasure in simply eating, simply drinking. What you could gain are a simple joy with food and an easy pleasure in eating that are your birthrights as a human being. It's very interesting language to me. When we learn to eat mindfully, our eating can be transformed from a source of suffering to a source of renewal, something that obviously got chopped off here from my slide. But it's something, if I remember correctly, something along the lines of renewal, self-discovery, this sort of thing, right? Okay, so I find this really interesting to analyze when I look at it because we've moved so far from sort of those Buddhist original monastic uses of mindfulness and understanding of what you're doing in the act of mindfulness. Here, you're going to be mindful while you're eating, and it's going to make eating pleasurable. You're going to really enjoy it. You're going to want to do it in this fashion more and more. And it's going to fulfill your birthright as a human being. That's not a very Buddhist turn of phrase. So where is this coming from? Very interesting. The Satipatthana Sutta, I keep going back to this one because it's good to just use a single text in a class such as this. It has something to say about bodies. There's a long passage about what bodies are like and what you should discover through mindfulness of the body. Mindfulness of the body is largely what's being taught through mindful eating. So in the sutra, what does it say you should learn? What's the lesson about bodies? According to the Buddha, a monk reviews the same body. He's reviewing it during mindfulness meditation. So mindfully reviews the body from the bottom of the feet to the top of the hair, and discovers that it's basically a big bag of skin full of all kinds of impurity, such as head hair, body hair, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, sinews, bones, kidneys, heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, large intestines, contents of the stomach, feces, bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, grease, snot, my favorite of all, oil of the joints. I don't really know what that is, urine, and so on. In this way, he abides contemplating the body as a body, internally, externally, and so on. He abides independent, not clinging to anything in this world. So by being mindful of the body, you discover this body is super gross. And you learn to no longer be attached to it, right? This is an original monastic use of these practices as taught apparently by the Buddha. Mindfulness is helping us to sort of get real about the state of our bodies and about the state of other people's bodies and about the state of really everything. So we become detached and so on, and we no longer chase after it. We no longer seek pleasure in the body or in food or anything else like this, right? And instead we turn our mind away from the world and towards nirvana. This is the original sort of purpose of these practices. So mindfulness of the body, this traditional perspective, it's not worth clinging to. It's all on its way to the cemetery. You can guess what the next slide is kind of going to be like, right? So the American perspective is a little different on this, right? We're not, these days, we're not into things like, body shaming or, this sort of thing, right? It's all about empowerment and loving yourself, loving your body. There's all the, the Dove soap ads about loving the size of your body, whatever it was, and all this sort of thing. There's this whole sort of message that people are trying to get out there about loving your body, loving yourself, and that when people aren't really happy with their body, that this is a primary source of suffering and anxiety and pain for people in this culture. This is the message that's out there. So if you're going to deal with that, if that's a problem of this culture, that people feel bad about themselves, you're going to use mindfulness not to get over bodies, but to come to affirm them. And you're going to use mindful eating as one of these sort of practices. Through the practice of mindful eating, you'll get back in touch with your body, and you're told that you'll discover how wondrous it is and how wondrous all its functions are, including eating and this sort of thing. So there's a really interesting sort of way in which mindfulness is now, in the mainstream, used to cultivate a better body that you can be proud of and appreciate and like. And it's also going to help you sort of take care of yourself and have more fun, more pleasure when you're eating. How do we do that then? Well, back to Susan Albers and her eating mindfully. What does she tell us? What is this actual process of eating mindfully? I keep talking all about how it's used, but I haven't actually described the process here. The key to changing the way you eat is not to develop discipline over your fork, but to master control of your mind. Becoming aware, becoming mindful, is the first step of being in control. Mindful eating requires you to consciously say to yourself, I choose to change my eating, and I'll work through any difficulties every time you sit down to eat a meal. So this is basically a type of discipline. It was very much a discipline in the monasteries too. So that aspect has survived. And the practice has survived as well, that you do it by putting your attention on the actions that you're performing. But the purpose and the result have changed here. So what is mindful eating, essentially? It's the act of eating and being aware that you're eating. It's kind of as simple as that, but of course there's more to it as well. So you pay attention to every action as you're eating. This is taught in MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, as well as many other forms of mindfulness training that you can encounter in America today. In MBSR, they often use a raisin. I mentioned this yesterday, so we'll sort of rehearse this here. The idea is that you take a single raisin, and first you just kind of look at it. There's a raisin. We'll just imagine a raisin here, right? So looking at our imaginary raisin, we just note what it looks like, how big it is, what its sort of shape is, everything about it. We're just there, aware there is a raisin. And then, moment by moment noting, deciding to finally eat this raisin, moving my hand to the raisin, picking up the raisin, so that as time is going by, moment by moment by moment, you're very aware of what you're doing the whole time. and then you've got the raisin there, and you might smell it, look at it a little more, and just be aware of what it is and how it is. Then finally, it gets in your mouth, so putting the raisin in my mouth, and then keeping your attention closely on what's going on so that you have the feel of it. You're aware of what it feels like. You're aware of the taste. You chew and you think, moving jaw this way, moving jaw that way. Like everything, you're just totally there with the act as it's happening without ever being distracted. This is contrasted by mindful eating instructors with the way that we allegedly usually eat, which is to say, we got like a big cheeseburger and everything. Everyone in these stories is always eating fast food, in my observation. So they got a big cheeseburger and a bunch of fries, and usually the television is on in these stories, and they're texting on their cell phone with their third hand, apparently, right? And maybe listening to music and arguing with their kids or whatever, all at the same time. And so they're doing everything except eating, even though they are in fact eating. So they're totally unaware that, they ate the burger, and then they ate the fries, and then they probably ate the wrapping too, because they're just totally not paying attention to what's going on in these stories as they're presented. Maybe you've experienced something like this. Maybe today, maybe every day. There's absolutely some truth to this presentation. But mindfulness then is the opposite of it. You're really aware that you're eating, and you're aware throughout the whole process of eating. And the idea here is that if you just are totally aware of what's going on, you won't react. Because remember, part of this mindfulness is about non-judgmentally observing what's going on. So you just eat that thing and you just let it be the experience that it is. You don't think, I wish this was something else, or don't obsess over it, or don't start thinking, when I'm done with this, I'll eat some more, and then I'll eat some more, and this sort of thing. You just stay with it the whole time. And the suggestion, and there is some data to back this up, is that people who eat in this fashion eat smaller portions. I guess they'd have to, because it's so much longer. One raisin at a time. Like, that's not, there's nothing magic about that. That's not like, that's just because you ran out of time, you had to go back to work. So certainly you eat smaller portions, but also you're actually fulfilled like this, because they say that people's usual way of eating is you got all this food, you got a certain amount of time, and you just kind of cram it in. And you eat what's on your plate. As we all know, American portion sizes are gigantic now. I say this as somebody who doesn't live in the US anymore. When I come here and I go to like a mainstream restaurant, it is freaky. Oh my gosh. I mean, in Canada, the portions are still, they're getting bigger too, but they're just not the same size as you go to, an Outback or something here, and there's just, so much food there. And people are like, well, there's this much food, I'm supposed to eat this much. So they eat the whole thing. Whereas if you're eating mindfully, because, among other things, because it's slower, and because you're being aware, you get full at a certain point, and you're eating slowly enough that you can actually become aware that you're filling up, and you're mindful, so you notice that you're becoming aware that you're filling up. Versus the I'm distracted mode, yum, 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 you keep eating, you're full, but you just keep putting it in there because the body hasn't reacted yet to tell the brain that, wait a minute, we're past capacity here. And then you pay for it later on, when you have a stomach ache in this way. Not to mention over the years as you put on the pounds. So this mindful eating, it can just very easily make people drop their portion sizes. They may eat more healthily because if they're really paying attention to what they're doing, they'll think about it. They'll even note feeling urge to eat an entire container of Ben & Jerry's. Questioning, is that the smart thing to do? Getting, the vegetables out instead. Like there's a moment there. You have more space because you're being slow and being mindful about it, and you can watch how the kind of mindless craving comes in, and you can choose not to follow it in this way, make a better choice. There's more to it as well, but these are some of the basic ideas behind this mindful eating. And it's, like I say, become a huge industry because people, Americans, are desperately looking for some way to deal with their poor eating habits, right? Everybody's very worried about whether they're too fat or too thin, or whether they're just not healthy, or this sort of thing. So it's very much a mainstream concern, and so it gets applied to this sort of thing. Okay, we are at 7:30, which is the time we typically take our break. So we can take some questions, right? Yeah, this cow, he's been taught mindful eating. He just realized, like, oh, wait. Okay, so questions if there are any. There's one right over here.
I'm thinking that if I ate that way, I would hesitate to eat meat.
Yep.
Yeah, because you'd start to think, where did this come from, and so forth. But even things like tempura, fried foods, deep fried foods.
Yes.
When you look at it long enough, I think you just lose some appetite.
Yeah, well, it certainly, if it sits there long enough, fried food does tend to not look as good as when it comes right off the stovetop. But yeah, the idea, though, is that you're going to enjoy the eating more, because instead of the eating being about quantity, it's about the quality of the experience. And you can kind of note, see the colors of the food, feel the different textures, taste all the different tastes that are going on. And so you don't need to, like, slather the salad with all the calorie-filled toppings you put on it. But if you just eat the salad and just really pay attention to it, that it's actually quite interesting, the material itself and so on. This is the theory that they're always saying. The Buddhist monks might counter, well, if you really look at it closely enough, it'll all gross you out no matter what it is. Like, even the salad is a bunch of dead organisms have been chopped up in this way. And so you'll start to move away from it. And, what can I say? That point of view hasn't been popular amongst the mainstream version of mindfulness now. Yeah, and as to whether you might stop eating meat, that, among other things, is an ethical question. So whether this mindfulness, which has been divorced from the traditional world of Buddhist ethics and morals, which was usually always an integral part of what was going on in mindfulness, it's been taken away because so much of that Buddhism has been wiped away, as we talked about yesterday, through specific processes. So the question is, if just this little bit of Buddhism is left, will it nonetheless be enough to stimulate people to act in make more moral choices and more ethical or healthful choices or whatever in this way? A lot of people in the mindfulness movement want to say, yes, it will still do that work anyways, just in a more passive way. But that's an open sort of question. But it's interesting that right away you note that. That might support their argument then. Other questions or comments? Is there anyone here?
I'll have a question.
Yeah, okay, go ahead, please.
Does it, in the American mindfulness eating concepts, they seem to be mostly about personal benefit.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And, taste or amount or type, that sort of thing.
Yep.
And, as contrasted to our Buddhist way of thinking about, food is the interconnectedness of, the sacrifice of living organisms to nurture us, and, all the connections of the people that bring it to the grocery store or grow it in the fields, and, and how we say itadakimasu,
right.
Before we partake. So I guess that, is there any other interconnectedness developing in the American mindfulness eating scheme of things? Are writers writing about it that way?
I would not say there's any of that developing in the American sort of mindful eating practices, but it is present at some places, right? So what tends to happen, as we've talked about, is that there's sort of all the possible places along the spectrum, from Buddhist and very traditional to totally non-Buddhist and totally non-traditional, like this many possible steps along there, right? And all of those exist within the total mindfulness movement in America. So those that are still having more Buddhist connections to them, even if they presented in a relatively secular idiom, but the person was trained in a Buddhist way, or it's still being taught, in some sort of Buddhist context. That often still maintains some degree of talking about the interconnectedness of things and about how the food arrives at your place connected to many other things. Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Buddhist monk who I've talked about a number of times, is one of the major mindfulness teachers. He will talk about how, for him, the raisin, or more like an orange, is often a thing that he's used in his teaching. He'll talk about how we should be mindful of the fact that this isn't just, a delicious piece of fruit, but all of the universe is contained in there, because it took the sun and the farmers and the wind and the rain and everybody had to collaborate in some fashion to bring this to you, to have the moment of eating. So we see that amongst Buddhist mindfulness teachers. But when they are not Buddhist mindfulness teachers, and there's a whole lot of these people, then whether or not that's there, it begins to drop off. Sometimes it still gets retained in some fashion, but a lot of times it's left behind. Because especially if it's really just directed towards a person with their own sort of self-intervention to control their weight or something like this, they're not seeking something that will tell them about sort of the metaphysics or the connection of everything this way. They're just trying to drop a few pounds. So then the focus is just on that very practical benefit in that way. So it's not to suggest, however, that the other thing doesn't exist, but it gets left behind by many people in the rush into the mainstream. Yes, right here, there's a question or a comment.
Well, it somewhat bothers me because it seems so self-centered. And isn't there a risk you're giving a lot of power to the problem itself?
Oh, that's a very interesting
So much
comment.
attention to the food rather than having gratitude for actually what little food we need or how our body works despite all of these things.
Yeah, you can absolutely make this critique, potentially. Some people do make these sort of critiques. They say that this sort of use of Buddhism, or Buddhist practices at least, is very self-centered. And in fact, if you're doing mindful eating as a diet strategy, like last week it was paleo diet, next week it's Atkins, this week it's mindful eating, which is absolutely something that does happen for some people in this way, right? Then basically it's actually completely narcissistic, So this does happen, but we should be aware it doesn't always happen. So it is something that is in there and is definitely a risk. But at the same time, I see other people who are doing it for other reasons. At least these teachers, people like Susan Albers and Jan Bays, feel that you're empowering yourself rather than empowering the food, because you're being able to take control over the thing. In their worldview, essentially their way of understanding how people operate, the people are already dominated, controlled by the thing they're obsessed with. So you're always eating chips, or you're always drinking a beer or something like this. And so it has the power over you. It has the control over you. It doesn't actually. The beer is not like, drink me, right? It's actually your own mind, but you don't understand your mind. Yeah.
Is it through that experience that it loses its power?
That's the idea.
If you work through that,
Yeah.
eventually it'll lose its.
That's what they like to say, right? Like in a really technical sense, it has no power. All this, it's always your mind. Buddhism is always about the mind, ultimately, right? All things exist in the mind. It is through the mind that we experience everything. And so when you're being controlled by the substance, be it food or alcohol or drugs, whatever, it's actually your mind operating in an unhealthy way, attaching, clinging, grabbing, in this way, right? At the end of this process, it's still going to be your mind, but you've taken it away from an unhealthy thing, and through this language of empowerment and everything, you've now gained the ability to operate in a much more healthy fashion, presumably, with these things.
Perhaps poison
maybe some detachment here. But the funny thing is, it's only partially, right? Like the real Buddhist monastic detachment we were talking about, you would see, you don't stop eating, you still have to eat, but you eat because you have to eat, and not because it's pleasure, it's your birthright as a human being, you're really going to enjoy. Like that's where the real American sort of idiom starts coming in and shifting what's going on with that. So there's some of both going on there. There's still a lot of Buddhist stuff in there, but there's a lot of stuff from the outside culture that's going on there as well.
Time for one more question.
Yeah.
Anybody?
Here we have. Wait for the mic if you would. Thank you.
As you talk about this orientation, the American orientation, I kind of get this feeling like it's not a very pretty one because it is very self-centered. What kind of God are we trying to create in the American mind, so to speak? And in order to be successful, do we give way to that trend, I guess is a question? Or how do we get around that by, or are we just being stuffy? I mean, because I remember reading books like The Zen of Motorcycle Maintenance,
Right.
or The Zen of Golf. It's all very interesting. It gives you a feeling of discipline in what you do, but at the same time, this kind of makes it almost crass. I feel like, wow, what's going on here?
Some people definitely do feel that way. The funny thing, you mentioned these two books, the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and Zen and Golf, or Zen and the Art of Golf, right? These are actually two books that exist, right? But they're actually very different. And to me, they're actually right there at the dividing line between sort of Buddhist uses and non-Buddhist uses. So if we look at, and the mindful eating is exactly the same way. So Robert Pirsig, who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, he was a Zen practitioner. He was really actually doing Zen, right? And if you look at Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, he says right at the beginning of the book, there's not much Zen in here, but actually it's a very Zen book. He's just not, using the formal terms. But he's talking about a way of seeing things, doing things, that has a meditative quality to it, so you begin to develop Buddhist-type sort of attitudes or ways of being, right? So you are repairing the motorcycle with such attention that you come to understand deeper truths about how things are. So in other words, the motorcycle maintenance, which you do mindfully, essentially, the motorcycle becomes the vehicle for discovering Buddhist truths about yourself and about how things operate. And that's the same way that mindful eating was used traditionally. Monks have been eating mindfully for 2,500 years. It's not as if Americans invented mindful eating, but mindful eating in the monasteries was about doing everything mindfully, right? You have to eat, so you will do it mindfully. You have to sweep, so you will clean mindfully. You will go to the toilet mindfully. Everything is like this in the monastery, so that mindfulness, meditation is not confined to the formal ritual period of it, but when you got to stop and eat, so it doesn't break it, doesn't interrupt it, but you just keep it going in this way. And in fact, then the eating itself becomes a vehicle for further understanding the Buddhist truths you're trying to get to. So that's the way the mindfulness eating has been. On the other hand, the art of Zen and the art of golf is about using Zen or mindfulness to improve your golf game. So it's gone from we use the activity to get to Buddhist stuff to we use the Buddhist stuff to improve the activity. And that's the same thing that can happen with this mindful eating. So if you're eating to, learn deeper truths, that's one thing. But on the other hand, if you're being mindful in order to eat better, that's a very practical, this worldly, American type benefit that certainly does risk becoming just about yourself, because we see how it's sliding away from from the religious content. So then the question becomes, is this an improper use of Buddhism? I think that's maybe what you're suggesting when you use a word like crass or something like that. Jan Bays, she's a Zen priest. What does she say? She says, okay, maybe yes, we would love it if people would go further with this, but the fact of the matter is there's 320-something million Americans. They are all suffering from bad eating practices. Suffering. I'm a Buddhist. I'm here to solve suffering. Granted, this is only going to take them so far, but if you wipe away an iota of suffering from 320 million people, that's a lot of suffering. Versus if you get one person all the way to nirvana. Like, okay, there's the kind of the death dimension, but there's the breath dimension as well. If we get rid of a little bit of suffering from everybody's lives, you did get rid of a lot of suffering from society. This is kind of a counter argument they have here. People go back and forth. As for myself, I'm not going to push any particular interpretation of this. You guys can figure out for yourselves whether you feel that this is appropriate or inappropriate or whatever like that. I'm very interested in the processes that go on here. Okay, so that was, I think, more than 10 minutes, so we need to take a break. We have some refreshments. You might want to consider eating them mindfully now that we know how to do so.
So chew slowly.
Yeah, chew slowly, but don't take too long. When do we want to rally
Yeah,
back?
you only have 15 minutes, so
15 minutes.
Chew appropriately.
Yes, yeah. Mindful speed eating, thank you.
And I will remind you when last refreshments and find your way back to your seats. And Jeff will begin again right now.
Okay, so maybe we need to mindfully stop eating now and bring our attention back if we could. Thank you all for staying. Let's see here. So yeah, moving on from mindful eating. So one example of a mainstream use of mindfulness. Yeah, let that clock stop. There we go. Okay. All right, let's try another one. Mainstreaming mindfulness. The joy of mindful sex. Better sex through mindfulness. This is another big phenomenon. Okay. So we're talking about how mindfulness is being used to by Americans to deal with the things they're obsessed about. So of course sex was going to be on this list, because let's face it, we're a pretty sex-obsessed culture. This is not going to be news to anybody. Puritan roots on the one hand, and then all sorts of craziness on the other hand, let's say. So food and dieting and weight are a big issue, so people use mindfulness, try to tend to it. And then people are seeking practical benefits around sex as well from mindfulness. You know, this is a big American concern. Sex is a very large source of serious anxiety for people. You know, am I doing it right? Am I getting enough sex? How am I going to have sex? What's going to happen? You know, am I a good lover? Am I having problems with my sexual activity? All these sorts of things. These are anxieties that many people have. So naturally, then the mindfulness is brought into this. And the funny thing is that whereas the mindful eating is often used to gain control over the eating, to reduce your eating, and cause you to stop being like, oh, I'm upset, I'm going to go eat a lot, and that's how I'll deal with everything. So you're trying to actually decrease what's going on with the eating in this way. What goes on with the mindful sex is, in a lot of cases, what they're seeking to do is actually increase the pleasure that you derive in sex and increase your sexual activity through the use of mindfulness. So here's just some examples of books that have been published in this sort of subfield of mindful sex. This is a small number of the many, many books that are out there, and websites, and mindfulness-based sex therapists, and all sorts of people that you can find out there with their, like I say, websites and YouTube channels and different sorts of things, or leading workshops and so on. So the interesting thing for me about this that I gathered, so this is a book that is, hello, we're going to talk about mindful sex, right? That's the topic of it. But for the most part, these are books that are sort of self-help or in some way, you know, for a general audience about dealing with sexual matters or problems or issues you may have. And it just so happens that when you read them, you discover that they are prescribing mindfulness during sex as a way to deal with sexual problems, right? So this is how mainstream it's become. It's not just, you know, mindful sex out there under its own title, but it just naturally fits into any book published these days relating to sexual problems that people might have. Also, it's interesting to me, the mindful eating, all the examples I gave you were by women, right? And the large majority of people reading these books are also women. And the examples that they use, they talk about this client, this person, everything, they're like 99% women in these books, as I read very, very many of them. So I say that, oh, food and diet and body image are a big American concern, yes, but at the same time, there are gender things going on here as well, so that certain ways in which mindfulness is being used, whether we recognize it or not, are being used to either deal with gendered anxieties or to, in some cases, take advantage of them, or at least have some sort of gender connections. Funny thing is, the mindful sex is largely a female concern as well. We often have a stereotype that sex is in some way sort of coded as male. Men are always chasing after sex in this way. It's not as big a female concern. Apparently, if you look into the mindfulness publishing industry and see what they say about sex, that stereotype falls away. It is the women who are writing about the sex, looking to have better sex through mindfulness, and having a lot of the chatter around this sort of thing. So it's a very interesting sort of thing. And it almost seems like when we're talking about male sexual difficulties, the medical prescription that's given to that is like little blue pills. But when we're talking about female sexual difficulties, the prescription people get is mindfulness instead. So there's definitely something going on here that I've been examining. And what do we find? So here we have The Sex Drive Solution for Women by Dr. Jin. She's the proprietor of Dr. Jin's Sex Den, which is her website and sort of business. It's she's a sex therapist, and for her, mindfulness is the #1 sort of secret way that you can improve your sexual functioning, particularly as a woman, because she is speaking to women in this thing. What does she say? Mindfulness may be the single biggest secret to both a good night's sleep and restoring libido. And I say this with assurance because it has saved my marriage and my sanity. Those are pretty tall orders there. Whatever kind of sexual activity you and your partner choose, bring mindfulness and sensory awareness to it. Here's how she actually describes it. Drink in the look, the scent, and texture of your partner's body. So be mindful during sex. Really attend to the body and what's going on. Sort of in the way the mindful eating, you paid attention to all the sensations. You're doing that now during sexual activity. Attune yourself to the sensation of kissing and touching, how the surfaces feel when your body touches them. ... I've cut out some of the more explicit stuff in here. The rewards of bringing mindfulness to sex are many. This is the practical benefits that are being sought here. Enjoyment is enhanced. So you're doing mindful sex to enjoy sex more. Overall stress decreases. You're doing mindful sex so you won't be stressed out during sex. Intimacy between partners is strengthened. So bonding is strengthened or heightened by mindfulness during sex. Mindfulness is a skill that can be learned and practiced by everyone, she says. So this is a very interesting sort of take on it, especially when we look back into the past and see how the mindfulness has been used, and then we look at this and see the way in which it's being sort of applied. Because what did the old monastic approach to bodies have to say? Be mindful of them, and you won't appreciate them more. You won't be more attached to them. You won't increase your bonding with your partner. If you look at the body closely with mindfulness, you'll be grossed out by it and you'll lose interest in it, right? And in fact, all that stuff about the body being full of all the gross stuff, that wasn't even really so much about you, a male monk, examining your body and discovering it. The real way this was most often applied in the tradition was looking at women's bodies in this way, right? Because the male monks, yes, they've taken a vow of celibacy, but they're still guys, and so they have these sort of urges, and then the mindfulness is supposed to cause you to look at the potential object of lust and note, oh, that person that I feel an urge for is in fact a bag of skin full of oil of the joints and spittle and bones and all the stuff we talked about, right? When you put it that way, it's really not so sexy anymore. And that's the point, right? Mindfulness was like an early abstinence program for these monks, right? So, but here, the exact same techniques are being used during sex, and suddenly they're allegedly, so when you're mindful, you actually appreciate your partner's body more. It's more interesting in this way. And you derive greater pleasure because instead of your mind being distracted you focus on the pleasurable sensations of this sort of thing. So this is being applied for the opposite reasons and sort of opposite ways, and yet, or without opposite outcomes, and yet it's still the same technique. It's really interesting how these things can change from being for celibate monks and they cut off desire to being for partners, often married partners, and how it increases the sort of pleasure they get. Why is this always for women? That's because a lot of the research suggests that many women have sort of lower levels of pleasure during sex than men do, and that it's quite common that women do not experience orgasm during sexual intercourse, and therefore people are trying to increase the level of pleasure they have, and the idea is often that women are not experiencing heightened pleasure because their minds are sort of distracted and not focused, and that the focus is very important for a woman's sexual functioning. So if she's mindful, then she'll be able to have better orgasms. That's what this is actually about, and there's research that they're doing to try to prove this. So it's as far away from an original usage, but mainstream America looks for this sort of thing, right? I suggested that you do like a mindful eating sort of exercise. We'll leave the mindful sex demo out. That can be your homework, I guess, and we'll just move on. Oh, not move on. I forgot there's one more slide. I couldn't resist this one. Okay, so this is for One Taste. It's a whole organization that's been set up just to promote mindful sexual touching, let's say. I'm not going to go too deeply into the details with this particular audience, but they sell the whole thing based on the practical benefits you will derive from doing their mindful sexual technique here. So it's going to do all these things. This is from one of their ads, essentially. So that selling of practical benefits to meet mainstream desires is really prevalent in this sort of thing. Okay, I'm moving on. You can be either relieved or disappointed. That's the end of the sex talk. Okay, mindful parenting. This is kind of like the second stage after the mindful sex. You end up with mindful parenting. So this is another big anxiety that people have these days. It's a huge industry, mindful parenting in some fashion. This is a little more gender balanced, but it still is mostly female. There's a whole lot more about mindful moms than there is about mindful dads out there. Like even if you run those keywords, you get way more hits for the one than for the other. So the idea here is that if you practice parenting in a mindful way, this is to say with actual moment-by-moment attentive awareness trained through Buddhist-connected mindfulness practices, then you will be a better, more attentive, more excellent parent, right? When your child is acting in a way, you'll notice what's going on. Because you notice what's going on, you can react in a better fashion than you might otherwise, right? If you're the kind of parent who's on the cell phone and apparently cramming a whole cheeseburger in your mouth and maybe trying to have sex at the same time, like if all these things are going on, then when little Johnny comes up and says, Mom, I need something, you don't pay any attention, and then he goes off and sets the house on fire or something like this. So if you're mindful, you pay attention to what's going on and you react more skillfully. Also, when the kid is acting poorly, instead of just reacting emotionally to everything, if you're mindful, you can be like, Johnny is screaming again. This is the kind of the noting exercise. Noting that Johnny is screaming. Noting that I'm so tired of the screaming. Noting that I'm reaching for the paddle. Putting the paddle away. Giving Johnny something to eat. Now he's not screaming. The mindfulness kind of intervenes in this way and allows you to make different and better choices, potentially. And because parenting is such a huge anxiety for people these days, it's natural that this mainstream anxiety, mainstream sort of desire calls forth a practical application of mindfulness then, right? I can tell you that as a parent right now, I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, this is a really big source of anxiety and worry that we have. as the size of the family decreases in American society, we then are comparatively putting more resources and more time and attention into just a few children, many fewer in this way. And so we get really invested in just this, one or two children, where our lives sort of begin to revolve around how well are they doing, how well will they do, will they have a chance at a good job, are they going to be happy, how are they feeling right now? It becomes a sort of I won't say obsession, that's a little hyperbolic, but it becomes a very strong, constant concern that you have. And then on top of that, then there's a lot of cultural pressure now to be very child-centric and to evaluate, are you being a good parent or are you not? This is a strong sort of pressure. And also there's cultural disapproval growing around things such as spanking or other possible forms of discipline. So rightly or wrongly, these sort of tools that people might have had are removed, and there's not necessarily a lot that takes its place. So parents find themselves pressured to be ever more child-centered, but with ever less sort of possible tools they can bring to bear on that sort of situation. And then on top of that, we have the sort of social media environment where you're sort of under constant surveillance, and your parenting is always being evaluated by others, because everybody's always uploading all their photos of what they did today to Facebook, and you go on Facebook and you look and you see like, oh, I see everyone else's children acted awesome today, and everybody else got an A, and then they all went for ice cream, and then the kids made their bed by themselves and put themselves in it, but first they thanked their parents profusely, without being asked. And you see all this, and then you're like, and meanwhile, like, okay, my kids got fed today, I think, right? So there's all this sort of anxiety and pressure around these things. They said the mindfulness will help you to deal with this and be a better parent. So, if you can't spank anymore, then at least if you're mindful, then you can try to think of other ways to deal with this sort of situation. Let's look at more examples. Mindful work. You got to go to work, make some money, so you can feed those brats. So, work, another major source of stress in American society, right? I don't think this is a secret. Everybody's stressed out about their work. They're stressed out because they're working too hard. They're stressed out because they're doing things they don't like. They're stressed out because they don't have enough work, or they're having to do too many jobs to make ends meet. They're stressed out because their boss is bad, they haven't gotten a raise, their coworkers are bad, or their employees are bad, whatever. Everybody complains about their work all the time, right? This is very common, except maybe not the bishop. He enjoys his job, but everybody else, work is a source of stress, right? I know you guys don't stress him out at all. So, since Americans are so work-focused, of course, this is mainstream concern, and it's going to call forth practical answers from the mindfulness movement, potentially. I can tell you that in Canada, there's a work culture there as well, but then you look back into the U.S. and it seems like it's really something. I don't know that there's the same sort of level of obsessive work ethic really anywhere else, at least amongst the Western nations. So it's really something. So then the idea is that if you're mindful while you're working, this is going to help you deal with the suffering that you derive from work, whatever it may be. So if your suffering is caused maybe because you're so stressed out about your work, well, we all know mindfulness helps deal with stress. That's what mindfulness-based stress reduction was about, right? So maybe if you can just stop and breathe a little bit in this way, then you can go back to work in a more sort of relaxed, mindful way, so you won't be sort of like freaking out about the work all the time, right? Or maybe if you're mindful at work, this will actually make you more efficient at what you're doing. This is what a lot of studies are suggesting these days, that whatever your work may be, that if you're doing it with mindfulness, you do that task better. This is one reason why a lot of corporations are paying for their employees to be trained in mindfulness, because it increases their work efficiency, right? So, think about it. Whatever your job is, you're on a factory line or you have to type stuff or whatever it may be, if you're mindful, you're not going to make as many mistakes. You're going to do your job better. And in fact, if you can really get into it in the way that like the mindful eating or the mindful sex is supposed to do, so that you kind of enjoy, get interested in every moment as it passes just for the moment itself, then even your work could potentially be transformed into kind of an interesting ongoing activity in this way. And certainly if someone is a doctor or a policeman or something like this, like we probably want them to be mindful, not mindless, not reactive and not distracted, but you want to make sure your doctor is actually paying attention when they're writing that prescription, right? Or you want that police officer to be mindful when they're trying to assess what's going on in this way. So there's a lot of ways in which mindfulness is being brought into different work environments with the idea that it creates different sort of practical benefits that people can take away from this. We have, therefore, also not just generalized mindfulness at work, but then it begins to sort of further specialize as further niches get exploited. It's not just work, but then specific workers. Like we have the mindful lawyer here, right? So there's several of these books, actually, that teach you how to be mindful as a lawyer. So you will do your job better, and also you will not be as stressed out. My dad is a lawyer, and I can tell you that it is a stressful profession. So maybe if you have a way to decrease your stress, then you will not burn out as easily, and also maybe you'll do your job better. Therefore, you can bill more hours and go home with more money. Okay. We have the mindful international manager, the mindful investor. There's so many of these. Basically, actually, if there's any sort of major profession out there, category of profession you can think of, I pretty much can promise there's already a book called The Mindful, whatever it is, fill in the blank for it. And the people have tried to say, not just be mindful at work in general, but they've tried to speak directly to that audience in some fashion to try to suggest how mindfulness is going to help them. Things like the mindful investor, you get the, this is very interesting because you get, look at the subtitle, How a Calm Mind Can Bring You Inner Peace and Financial Security. In other words, you're going to make more money if you're mindful during your investment, right? So there is the thing about inner peace, but it's also about financial security. In fact, there's a whole book, I don't have it up here, but it's called Mindfulness and Money, which is about how being mindful when trading stocks and all this sort of stuff will, you'll do much better in these ways. It's an interesting sort of situation. And then let's look at a final example of mainstream uses or mainstream applications of mindfulness meditation techniques derived from Buddhism, and that's sports, mindful sports. This is actually one of the earliest ones. Before the rise of mindful sex and mindful work and everything, mindful sports was one of the first applications people were doing back in the early 1980s. In fact, one of the very first people to do it was this gentleman, George Mumford. I just remembered I have a laser pointer. I haven't used it the whole time, so now I'll finally get my chance. All right, so here he is. He wrote this book, The Mindful Athlete, but he wrote that fairly recently. He's been out there for, let's see if I can do the math. I'm in religious studies, not the math faculty, but he's been doing this for over 30 years. He's actually been teaching athletes. He started with Olympic athletes. I think it was maybe an Olympic rowing team. It taught them to be mindful during their athletic competition, and then this improved their performance. That's the idea. So it's mindful sports is about being mindful to improve your performance. So you'll be a better competitor. You're more likely to win if you're mindful while doing your sports. Some other examples, like I said, George Mumford's really a real pioneer in this sort of stuff. It became very famous here with Phil Jackson with the Bulls in the 1990s when he had Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, and he took the Bulls to the championship, and he was teaching them mindfulness, and allegedly this was part of why they were such an incredible powerhouse team. The Bulls, you may recall, this was a global phenomenon. Kids all around the world were wearing, Bulls T-shirts, and everybody wanted to be like Mike and all this sort of thing, right? So the whole idea was this mindfulness was really helping. There's a quote in here, in basketball, as in life, true joy comes from being fully present in each and every moment, not just when things are going your way. Well, that sounds great, but what he really means is, of course, being fully present on the court means that you'll shoot better, you'll better notice who's getting open and pass the ball to them and everything. Like the team's going to function better, you're going to function better, and so you're going to win. You're going to beat the other guys by being mindful. And that's also what this is here. Here's that magazine again, Mindful, that I keep going back to because it's such a good example of this sort of stuff. So here we have Pete Carroll, the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks. There's Russell Wilson, the star quarterback, and as you can see, he's meditating out here. Pete Carroll taught mindfulness meditation practices to the Seahawks, and they would do these at practice every single time, and they all alleged that this was very helpful in improving their game. So because they're mindful, they're able to really pay attention to what's going on. In fact, time almost seems to slow down in a way because they get so good at following moment by moment in this way. So they have better reaction times. They can more comprehensively think about what they need to do. They can get in the zone and go after the ball and just grab it. When others are taunting them, which is a common tactic on the field to try to get you angry and distracted in this way, and then your performance goes down, they could just mindfully, just like, someone's talking smack, hearing the smack, letting it go. You know, they just don't have to react in that way. They can learn these sort of techniques, and then they're calm, cool, collected, and focused, while the other guy's getting angry that his trash talk isn't doing anything. So he's decreasing his performance, and you're increasing your performance. So this was a big part of the Super Bowl what was it, 2 years ago, I guess, where they were all talking about the Seahawks are going to win because they're all mindful and everything. And then, of course, the New England Patriots destroyed them. I'm from Connecticut, so, you know, I just had to get that in there. Mindfulness can only go so far, apparently. It helps if you deflate the balls, apparently. So, oh well. Yeah, I guess I have to cop to that, yeah. There was a little something else going on with Tom Brady, apparently. So, anyways, these are several examples of very mainstream uses of mindfulness, right? These are not Buddhist uses of mindfulness. In fact, in some ways, they're the precise opposite of what were classical Buddhist uses of mindfulness. If we locate mindfulness meditation as classically existing in the celibate monastic Sangha, yes, there's more to Buddhist mindfulness, but these practices specifically were Buddhist monastic practices, right? So what do we find? Well, you know, there was mindful eating, but the mindful eating was so that eating wouldn't get in the way of your practice of meditation and achievement of nirvana, right? And there was certainly not mindful sex, right? Monks who were having mindful sex were ejected from the monkhood right away. That's a fail, right? Okay? There's not mindful parenting by monks. They have left the household, right? They're living in the Sangha instead. You know, if they're not going to have mindful sex, so they're not going to need mindful parenting and so on. There's not really mindful work, traditionally speaking. Yes, monks absolutely do labor around the monastery, and this is an important sort of thing, but monks have not typically been wage earners, and that's what we mean by mindful work. It's about being in your cubicle in the rat race of American capitalist society and everything. That's what mindful work is about, right? That's why we've created it, because we're in that situation, are looking for solutions for it. So the monks, yeah, they were mindful while they're sleeping, or maybe, you know, mindful while carrying some water. That's a totally different thing from being like a mindful hedge fund manager, right? These are basically not even the same thing at all. And mindful sports, you know, monks were not supposed to be playing sports. They were supposed to be actually avoiding all forms of secular type entertainment. Is that actually what happened? No way. Like we've seen that movie The Cup probably, right? With the Tibetan kid who's all into soccer and this sort of thing. Monks actually do play sports, but they're not doing it, not using mindfulness to score goals and this sort of thing. I mean, the very point of this is to improve your competitive edge and beat the other guy. This is, not, let's say, a traditional Buddhist sort of activity in this way. Not to be down on sports and this sort of thing. We all enjoy them. Apparently, everybody golfs, right? But we have to admit that at the end of the day, it is not necessarily exactly consonant with certain types of Buddhist motivations. So these are all non-Buddhist or even possibly anti-Buddhist ways in which Buddhist-derived mindfulness meditation is being used. And it's used this way because these are mainstream desires that people have. And these are the practical benefits that people think they're going to get from that. These are just a few of the examples that are out there. There's many other ways that people are using mindfulness. Actually, if there's anything that you can think of and you say, oh, this is a thing Americans are concerned about or a thing that they worry about or whatever, chances are very, very high that someone somewhere has written a book or an article or something saying, if only you were mindful, then that wouldn't be such a source of anxiety in this way. So I could go on with some other examples, but I wonder if maybe this is another good time to take a pause and see if people have questions, reactions, suggestions, anything at all that they would like to share here. Please.
From a sociological perspective, you have to be in a certain economic safety zone to be able to pursue mindfulness. I mean, if you're down and out and homeless and that sort of stuff, one, I would assume, does not pursue one of these programs.
That's an excellent observation or possible question there. Is there more, or shall I say something on it?
As expansive as you said that mindfulness is in the United States, there's still a whole bunch of people that totally don't find it to be important.
Yes. So you're right. So the truth of the matter is, in theory, mindfulness is free. And people keep saying in these slides over, anyone can do it, right? That's the whole point of it. So, I mean, theoretically, anyone can follow their breath. Everybody's breathing. If you're not breathing, you've got a serious problem that mindfulness is not going to solve, right? So, like the homeless guy down the street over there in the park, right, by the big torii gate, right? He's breathing right now. He could be there's nothing stopping him from practicing mindfulness. So in theory, it's absolutely available to everybody. But in reality, in fact, what this is it mainly reflects middle-class American concerns. That's the mainstream we're looking at, right? So the sports. So these guys, top athletes. I mean, heck, they're just plain rich, right? And few of us are top athletes. So they're a type of 1% in a way, right? But even beyond that, if you've got a TV, if you're able to go to the sports stadiums and see all this sort of stuff, you're already that's recreation. It implies you have some free time, you have some recreation time, which not everyone has, right? Let's see here. Nothing about, actually, there's nothing that I've ever seen about mindful, mindfulness at McDonald's, or mindfulness on the factory line or this sort of stuff. It's always white collar stuff that they're talking about, because these are middle and upper middle class authors speaking to a middle and upper middle class self-help consuming, a self-help genre consuming audience. They just naturally assume these things. Mindful investors, you have to have a certain amount of free capital available to invest if that's going to be relevant to you. The mindful international manager, that's the high level sort of thing. Mindful lawyers, these are people with multiple postgraduate degrees, right? So this is very high up, actually, sort of thing. Mindful leadership, not mindful, barista, but the mindful leader up here running everything. So there's very much a class thing that's going on here that the people in the mindfulness movement often don't acknowledge. There are some who do, and but it's a common phenomenon where it isn't really talked about. I talk about it in my book, actually. I do a whole sort of class analysis of this sort of thing. Mindful parenting happens at all levels of the spectrum, but the real interest in sort of mindfulness and helicopter parenting, which is what comes in, that's a middle class and upper middle class phenomenon primarily. This does not mean that people in the lower class don't care about their kids, aren't concerned about it. Duh, of course. But the concerns are very different. Like a lot of things like, so momfulness, for example, she talks about how harried she is as a parent, but also how rewarding it is. And, but her problems are like, oh, there's so many soccer games to take the kids to, and, oh, I worry about the kids, and this was, like sometimes I got to lock myself in the bathroom just to have a few moments of time by myself and everything. It's not like I'm worried as a parent because my kid might get shot on the way to school. It's not that kind of thing, right? So there's a very certain class location here that isn't often surfaced. And back here with the sex stuff too, I guess. Yep, these are all oriented towards middle class people. I was going to go to the eating. Cows. I don't know if cows are middle class or not. I'm going to skip that, actually. There's too much of this stuff. But the eating is very much geared towards a middle class audience as well. Like there's, they're usually not dealing with lack of food. That's not the food anxiety. It's actually usually that people have a lot of food and then they're misusing it in some fashion, right? The people are all in these books. They always have access to food, to entertainment, to income, these sort of things, right? Now, like I say, the mindfulness movement is very large. There are some people who are trying to bring mindfulness into less advantaged communities. There's a lot of work done in so-called inner city schools with trying to deliver mindfulness programs there. There's mindfulness stuff that goes on in the prison system. So we find mindfulness actually throughout the spectrum. But these big mainstream things, kind of like the front face of the mindfulness movement, is all for middle class people and all reflects their concerns. And it's then just certain people who then take it over into these other sort of socially disadvantaged locations and try to apply the mindfulness there. So a very astute observation, thank you. Let's see here. Let's make sure everybody has a chance to talk who has not necessarily talked today. I want to hear from everybody, but let's just make sure everybody.
Where does the U.S. Army's mindfulness fitness training come in? On the one hand, it looks like it goes against Buddhist precepts. On the other hand, it sort of looks like samurai Zen.
That's an excellent question. I plan to talk about it tomorrow, so I'm just gonna leave that for tomorrow. Yeah, I've got a slide exactly with the mindfulness fitness training. Yeah. So let's see here. There's a question here too, and over here, Rod also. Yeah, please.
My question is, your topic tonight's about the mainstreaming of mindfulness, and so there's this incredible growth now. To what extent do you think that this is a flavor of the month, that because it's not really rooted in tradition, that it goes away? For example, I remember several decades ago, Japan at one time was a big thing, like, management by Japanese principles, but you don't see any of that now.
Yep. Right.
So what's your prediction in terms of the life cycle of mindfulness in all of this mainstreaming?
That's an excellent question. This is a fad. I can just straight up say this is a fad. It's experiencing its moment, and there will be some sort of cooling off at some point. But on the other hand, it also, I think, has much longer permanent, possibly, certainly longer staying power, because something like Japanese principles of management, that's the hottest thing for a moment. Back when Japan had its bubble, Japan's been in a recession for decades at this point. So nobody wants to govern like a Japanese corporation at this point. I wouldn't recommend it. according to the Japanese, right? They've had serious economic troubles. So some things come and go, but this mindfulness has been so widely spread into so many aspects of American culture that even if something else comes along somewhere, it's also, the mindfulness is over here too, and it's over there, and it's all over the place. And because so much scientific research and money is being driven into this, and they appear to be getting results to suggest that there genuinely are benefits, like a medical or psychological benefits that come out of this, it's becoming what I would say a permanent option within American healthcare. So there'll be further techniques that come along, but I think the mindfulness will stay as a sort of option. You know, in terms of the big cultural moment, that will probably pass. But on the other hand, we've seen cycles with this interest in Buddhism as well, right? There was a lot of interest actually in the late 19th century in Buddhism amongst Americans. Then it kind of died off for a while, and then it came back up again, and then we had the war, and it kind of went to that. Then we had the 50s and the 60s, got really big, and then cooled off a little bit. And then in the 90s, Hollywood was cranking out these movies about Tibet and everything. And then, you know, a little cool off, and now mindfulness everywhere. So, you know, it's going to, even if it dies off for a while, it's going to probably come back around again. And because this mindfulness so successfully permeated, I think it's going to always now be there. Whether it's an active or latent resource, it's always going to be there from now on, I would suggest. So we'll see. It's easy enough to make a prediction now because I won't be here later on when we find out the answer. Oh, sorry, we'll get to you too. Yeah. Rod was asking too, that's great. I think we have time for at least 2 comments, so that's fine, please.
You mentioned mindfulness in prisons. I was wondering, what kind of, has there been research in mindfulness in prisons and mindfulness in special education, autistic kids, that kind of thing?
Yes. So tomorrow also I plan to talk about mindfulness in prisons and mindfulness in the schools and mindfulness in the, so I'll save this for tomorrow as well. Otherwise, you guys won't really have any reason to come back. So we'll save it for tomorrow.
My question came out of thinking about sports, and I wondered because I know that with golf, you really have to concentrate, and you hate someone who's distracting you.
Yes.
And that used to be my husband's mode of operation. He would distract his opponent.
Yep.
So, would mindfulness training also serve to strengthen one's mind to avoid too many of these distractions?
Potentially. I mean, Tiger Woods, you know, his background is part Buddhist, and he claims that, you know, Buddhist meditation is part of what helped make him such a good golfer, right? So absolutely, people are, I don't know if I would use the word strengthening their mind, they're certainly training their minds in a way through this sort of mindfulness. So if not having reactivity is a big part of what comes out of this mindfulness, then, you know, exactly, his kind of tactics might not work. Because if I'm mindfully golfing, then I'm thinking, you know, picking up the driver, preparing to swing, listening to that jerk over there trying to distract me, noting that it won't work, swinging, you know. Maybe you can kind of get away from it in that case. Versus, you know, the not sort of mindful approach would be getting ready, and then he starts talking, then you're thinking all about it. And even when he stopped, you're still thinking, oh, I can't believe he did that. He's trying to screw me up, but he's such a jerk, blah, 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 blah. Like, he's quiet now, but he's still winning, you know? With the mindfulness, you would just allow the thing to happen, then you'd allow it to pass away, and you just concentrate on what you're doing at this time. So yeah, potentially it could work. Again, I want to point out that my intention here is not necessarily to say whether these are good or bad or right or wrong uses of Buddhism. It's just to note that this is actually what people are doing with Buddhism. And they are doing it because they think it will give them something they want. And we may say, this is, you don't want the right thing. Buddhists have been saying this for 2,500 years. Some people might say that's what Buddhism is, basically saying you want the wrong thing, stop, put your mind onto something better in that way, right? But on the other hand, we can all expect that people will want what they want, and they want largely what their culture has taught them to want. Americans want these things, they don't want some of these other things. And so naturally they use the techniques that are available to them. When mindfulness is made available to them by the processes we looked at yesterday, then they're going to use it for these sort of purposes. So to me, it's a very interesting phenomenon.
Whoa. Okay. Just a heads up, this is going to be our last question for tonight.
Yep.
Is there evidence that when one pursues one of these mindfulness sorts of programs, whether there's evidence but that it improves one's interpersonal relationships? I mean, there's a spillover factor, or does it cause negative things? Like I can remember when my wife became a vegetarian, I just hated, I was against the whole thing, right?
Right.
And so it didn't necessarily help our marital relationships, but she was doing it for her own kind of self-power improvement or whatever.
Okay. I can see though that since then you've totally gotten over this, and you're not stuck on that at all. So good for you. I focused on the mindful sex thing, but a closely related phenomenon. Some of the same authors talk about also like mindfulness in relationships. So it's not just about the physical side of it, but the emotional side of it as well. And they stress that through mindfulness you can strengthen or repair your relationship, that it improves bonding. Because if you're mindfully attentive to your partner, then you come to appreciate them better, and they feel better appreciated, and so the bonding sort of takes place here, right? So this is really ironic because mindfulness meditation was used for the opposite back in the day. You're supposed to be leaving your attachments and your relationships behind, and they were a serious source, a serious impediment to achieving higher levels of spiritual awareness, according to Buddhism. But yeah, absolutely, people believe that it happens. There are studies published that suggest that it happens. As I said yesterday, the quality of much of this research is up for dispute. But there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, certainly, to suggest that some people derive some benefits from it. And maybe some of the scientific research is okay, too. Yeah, so people are absolutely doing it for this sort of thing. I think it's interesting, though, that you note that sometimes seemingly good practices may have negative repercussions or consequences anyways. And this can happen with mindfulness, right? The truth of the matter is that mindfulness historically has been recognized as something that not everyone can engage in. So people are pushing everyone can do it. One thing is these sort of instructors and coaches are convinced that everyone can do it. But also, if everyone can do it, that means many more people can buy their books and products, right? So there's both of these things going on here. Traditionally, monks did not at all believe that everyone could do it. Only certain people were sort of karmically advantaged at this time to be able to do these sort of practices. And they had to be done in a close, supportive environment with a trained master who had already, completed the path and now is walking you through it, and with the supportive peers moving at the same level in a tightly controlled monastic environment. Otherwise, all sorts of negative psychological effects potentially come from these practices. In the sutras, they're often described as possession by Mara, sort of the Buddhist devil in this way. There's many, many stories in the Theravadan scriptures about Mara coming and taunting or tempting people while they're trying to meditate, or even taking their body over, and then they're like fighting with him. You can see how potentially there's sort of mythological descriptions of psychological turmoil that's going on as people are performing mindfulness meditation, right? So And then even in the 70s, when when Buddhists were doing sort of research into this stuff before it became just purely medical, people like Jack Kornfield, his dissertation was a study of the effects that people have on a mindfulness retreat. And he found many positive effects, but also he found significant reporting of problems people had, or strange phenomena. People reported having strange sensory phenomena, or feeling like weird urges, or hearing voices telling them to do things, or experiencing all sorts of problems that we would suggest are sort of mental imbalances maybe, that the mindfulness was provoking, even in this retreat setting. And in the tradition, there's certainly a lot of support for if you're getting that's going on, they'll teach you a way to deal with it, or they'll move you off of that practice and try something else. But if you're just out here swimming in the sort of self-help genre, teaching yourself mindfulness, if it does have these sort of effects, there's not necessarily anyone there to catch you and change that about you. So maybe that's kind of my reaction to this anecdote about she was doing something good, she was being a vegetarian, but it was having bad effects. In the same way, mindfulness may have bad effects also. And at the same time, for many other people, it's doing apparently good stuff. They are losing weight, they are gaining some control over their substance addictions, they are having better sex, and they're not as stressed at work, and they're not kicking their children around the house quite as much. So we can say with everything, there's always mixed results, right? So mindfulness is like that as well, potentially. Okay, I think that does have to be our final comment for tonight. It's very nearly 9 o'clock. Thank you all once again for your attention. Tomorrow, our topic will be making America mindful. So that's how I'm going to talk about how people are not just using these are very sort of self-oriented, individualistic uses of mindfulness, but there are many people who believe that mindfulness done on a larger scale or in a certain way will actually improve American society and not just American individuals. So that'll be an interesting topic for tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Let's put our hands together.